Complete?
Yep, we're ready.
Okay, very good. So we'll pick up. We're in an interesting part now. Last week we said we started Nun Amid Beis. We Amar Rava, we gave the definitive halacha that Rava stated. We had all these discussions about how we view Oino and Shtus. And Rava said categorically, the halacha is that less than a sixth there is no collection. It's an immediate sort of waiving of any money, immediate. More than shtus, the the entire transaction is void, and a shtus itself, then you give back the oino, but you can't void the deal. And we said that the amount of time that you have is the amount of time that you can show it to an appraiser or to a relative. So Rava was very direct. He didn't mince any words. He said that's the halacha, and that's it, right? Now, to explain Rava, we had, and what Scott showed us on Merkava, we had Tanya Kavose de Rava, right? We wanted to bring a proof to Rava, and we brought a proof from the Brisa, which said those exact words. The less is totally obviated, more is void, and the shtus is bikach metal, is bikach mekech. But that Brisa had a machlokes, right? I mean, that's the definitive word, but that was Rab Nosson, Divrei Rab Nosson. He is the one who echoes the words of Rava. Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi, he added something, and he said, and this is where we departed from the halacha. Remember, we kept saying the halacha is one thing, and our Mishnah is something else. This is the Mishnah. That Mishnah where Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi, who was the Mesader of the Mishnayos, he came along and he said, no, that the Yad Mocher, the hand of the seller, which we interpreted to mean not literally seller, but whoever is the defrauded party, Yad Mocher, Yad Lokech. It says Yad Mocher, and this is a machlokas which we'll discuss today. But at least our thinking is that he said whoever is the defrauded party is Yodo Ala El Yona. He has the upper hand. What does that mean? That means in a case where there's an actual shtus, an exact sixth of fraud, then the person who is defrauded has a choice. He can either vitiate the deal, or he can say, I want the deal, but I want my six back. And that was what the Mishnah said. And you recall, we said the halacha is different. And we know the halacha is different because we just said it. Omar Rava. Rava is the halacha. And the halacha is that with an exact six, you don't have a choice. You have to take your onah. You have to take the six back. But the deal is intact. So, in other words, the Chachamim said, in order to foster an environment of mekach hamemker, of business. In other words, you don't want to dry up the business world. What we say, okay, things happen. Sometimes it's not the exact amount, it's a little bit more, a little bit less. So let's not get caught. This is Chazal. Let's not get caught up in all the details. If it's less than a six, mach the shows. Don't worry about it. It comes out in the wash. If it's more than a six, then you've really defrauded somebody. If it's an exact six, then okay, you get your money back and we move on because we want commerce to continue. And that seems to be a logical way of putting it. It's only the Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi who disputed that and said, no, I don't want to see with an exact sixth. I want to be able to see options. And the option is either to wipe out the deal or collect the money. All right, so that's definitive. Now that's what we said last week. Then we went on to give different examples of different cases, and we're up to now on Daf Nun Aleph, Omid Aleph. We are in the wide lines where it says Hahu Gavra Davanoket Varshave Luzvune. Right, so where is that? It's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines into the wide lines in the middle of the page, right? So last week we gave an example of someone who, a couple of examples, someone who made a mistake. He sold wine and he made a mistake, and then he came before Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman said um, that you can. So we made a chilik. Remember, so the other point that we made, which is important, is that this whole discussion of fraud really applies to a buyer, not to a seller. A seller has forever to undo a fraud, and we gave a reason, very good reason. The reason is because the buyer has the chayfetz, right? The transaction went through. He has the chayfetz, so he can show the chayfetz to people, and they can tell him, "Oh, you overpaid, you underpaid, whatever the case." But the seller, once he sells it, he no longer has the chayfetz. Who is he going to go to if he feels he's been defrauded? Now, you're going to ask, how is a seller defrauded? That's because in a vacuum, a seller may not know how much to charge. And he may just say, I think this is what it's worth. He's in some village, on the outskirts of a city, and he doesn't really know what's going on in the city. So in the village, he doesn't know a price. So he picks a price and he sells it. Now, did he make a mistake? Well, how does he know? The only way he knows is when he comes across a similar item later, and that item is so grossly different from what he sold, that he says, oh my goodness, I undersold this by 50%. How can I do that? So therefore the Gemara says we have to give the seller more leeway, and therefore he can retract at any point in time. And I think somebody asked the question, well, this could be 6 months later. What are we going to do? We're going to upend the deal. We're going to make a whole tararam here, and everybody forgot about the deal already. They went on to other business. So that's a little bit schwer, because there's seemingly no time limit. So then somehow the parties have to adjust that at some point later if it was so grossly different than what the price is. And again, in the eyes of the Chachamim, 1/6 is a gross distortion of price. Now we may not think so because sometimes the numbers get so big that what is it? It's a few bucks. Who really makes a big deal? But I guess in the times of the Gemara, when they were selling things for, if it's a low number, which oftentimes it is, then you're right, a 6 doesn't amount to a whole lot, maybe, a couple shekel, whatever it happens to be. But nevertheless, the Chacham said to a number of people who can't afford it, that is a big number. It's just when the numbers get so out of line, because you're talking about hundreds and maybe thousands of shekalim is a 6, then it's a whole, then you might be able to understand why a seller who doesn't know what he's doing, and we shouldn't penalize him then necessarily. And you could say, oh, he should do his homework, he should know what he's selling, and a chanami. These are all valid questions. Why is he going out in the market and selling something if he has no idea what he's selling? That's a whole different story, but at least we see from the case of the Gemara that the Amoraim do not penalize him. So in any event, let me just, Jay, 1 second. So we said that there is a chilik between a buyer and a seller, and we gave one other example, and that was the example of someone who sold no, actually we did that Gemara. Who gave it okay, he sold some ribbons, and we said in that particular case where he upsold it from 5 to 6, which is a shtus, and in theory, if someone had offered him 5.5, he would have taken it. Now 5.5 is less than a shtus. Then, in other words, the seller would say, you know what, I'll take a half a shekel or 50 zuz less, 5 zuz less, whatever the half of zuz less, and get away with it because it'll be less than a shtus. And everybody says that less than a shtus is immediate mechila. So then the buyer, who was a smart guy, he said, why should I pay 5.5? I'm going to pay the full 6, and then come back and say it's a shtus and get the whole zuz back. In other words, if I agree to 5.5, I get nothing back because it's less than a shtus. If I pay the full zuz from 5 to 6, that's a shtus. That's a full 1/6. and then I can go to Beis Din and claim. So the Gemara answered not so fast, because there's a difference. In that Gemara, they're saying that there's a difference between buying and transacting with a professional, meaning a seller, or I'm your buddy, Jay. You and I are friends, and you want to sell me something. You're not a professional seller. You just want to sell me something. The Gemara says that if it's like off market, if it's not a market deal, because I'm not going to a professional seller, then you can't come back and claim the extra zuz, because it's understood that a private person, not a seller in the marketplace, may value his chayfetz, whatever it is that he's selling, a little bit more, and we're not makbid, we're not particular on that, and we don't allow the inyan of shtus to apply when it's between two people who are not in a buyer-seller relationship, and that's important to remember. Okay, that's where we're going to pick up. Go ahead, Jay.
I'm still a little confused. Earlier in the introduction, you said that Rava wanted options. Was it Rava? I think you said he wanted options. He didn't agree with.
No, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi
wanted options.
Wanted options. Yes.
Okay, so the question is that it's officially 1/6 is the demarcation. Now,
Right.
here's a nice Jewish frum man who says, "Okay, I'll do 1/6 exactly, because that's what they in halacha is." So why does somebody come along, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and say, "No, I know it says 1/6, but I want options"? How does he dismiss the fact in his own thinking that 1/6 is not perfect?
No, here's the point. The point is that we have to pick a number. You can't just random. You can't say, so the Chazal, they probably, honestly, may have sat and cogitated about this. Okay, let's look at the marketplace and let's understand the marketplace. What is the marketplace like? So we don't know what it is in the time of the Gemara, but they came up and they said, you know what? It seems like 1/6 is the right number to be able to demarcate between fraud and no fraud. Less than a sixth is no fraud. More than a sixth is major fraud, let's call it, and you can void the deal. 1/6 is enough of a fraud that you are required not to void the deal, says Rava, but just to repay the 1/6 and then move on. So Rava is basically, he's saying that we have to have clear guidance. So less, more, and exact. Now, come to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and he's not changing that. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is not arguing on Rava and saying, Rava, I don't agree with you that less, more than 1/6 is the right way to go. The only thing I'm disagreeing, and again, we have to understand the basis of what he's thinking. His thinking is that when you have an exact 1/6, which we call fraud, we're calling that fraud, then the defrauded party should have options in that he should be able to say, that defrauded party should be able to say, I want my 6th and move on, or I feel so slighted that I don't want to make the deal with this guy. So in other words, the 1/6 doesn't change the halacha that that's fraud. What it changes in Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's mind, unlike Rava, is you can't just take your 1/6 and move on. He's saying that the psyche of the person who has been defrauded is such that he may not even want to deal with this fellow because, for instance, you want to go in partnership with somebody, and then you find out that that person hasn't been wholly honest with you. And he says, Chatasi, Avisi, Pashati, I'm going to give you back what isn't right, but let's make a deal together. How do you feel about that? Do you feel that this is someone who's trustworthy and that you want to stay in business with him? Again, now that may be more subjective than an objective view, because you could say, oh, it was a toast and I get my money back and I'm going to keep a watchful eye and I'm going to do that. Now, we're talking about Mekach and Memka. We're not talking about joining forces for business dealings for the next 10 years. We're talking about a buy and a sell. So if you buy something from someone and then you get the right amount of money back and you have the chayfetz and you move on, the chayra, you don't even have to deal with this guy ever again, but you have the chayfetz, which now is at the right price because it's been adjusted because of the price fraud. And then you could say, okay, I have the chayfetz, I paid the right price, I'm moving on with my life. So it's not quite the same, but according to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he was more sensitive to the fact that someone who felt he was defrauded because it was exactly 1/6, he should have options. That's what we mean by options. Clearly, it's a fraud. Rava says, pay him and move on. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in that brisa says, no. It's not just simply pay and move on. Sure, you can pay and move on, but if the feelings are such that you don't want to deal with this individual, you should have the right to walk away. And that's all the machlokes is. We're gonna build on that today, but I repeat it because it's important to understand that that's not the halacha. Rava came with a definitive halacha. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in our Mishnah said different, but that's not the halacha. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, it may be more emotional than it is actual legal. You know, it's legal, you just give him the money and move on. That's legal. You know, illegal is the brain. You know, you made it okay. It's a shtus, and you have to pay it. But Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is going extra legal, as we like to say. It's not just a matter of legality; it's also a matter of maybe ethics or emotions or whatever you want to call it. And therefore, in his halacha, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's halacha, you are allowed to void the deal at 1/6 exactly. But we see that that's not the halacha. Remember, halacha has to be definitive. You can't be wishy-washy and say, yeah, maybe some cases yes, some cases no. So Rava stated the halacha. It says, Rava Hilchasa. This is the halacha. But then we saw, and then we had been quoting it in the past, we saw that our Mishnah was different than the halacha. Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda Nasi felt that in the case of a shtus, it's not just pure, what we like to call equity. So it's not just pure halacha, black and white halacha. It's also the equities of it that, you know, you slighted me, you wanted to cheat me with a shtus. I want to have the option of saying, I don't want to do business with you. And again, you can't go much beyond that because that's basically the machlokes here. Rava is strictly a legal opinion. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is saying it's more than just a legal opinion. It's also maybe ethical or moral or whatever you want to call it. And therefore, even with an exact shtus, he should have the option of opting out. Okay, so now, go ahead, Menashe.
So one way I sort of think about it is you have this idea, you have the idea in many places of the letter of the law and the spirit of the law.
Right.
And so the letter of the law might say, and this is a conflict, it might say up to and including 1/6. And there's, you know, logically that's as good a halacha as any in terms of whether it's up to and including or up to but not including is kind of arbitrary. But the idea to say that, well, if you say it's up to and including, but as somebody who's literally right on that, they're pushing the limits. They may be on the letter of the law, but it's not the spirit of the law. Because to actually take exactly 1/6 is not so much a random thing. That's more likely that somebody's saying, oh, I want to get every last penny or every last shekel, and we don't want that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let me give you the best example. I mean, it's kind of a different sphere, but this week's parsha. I mean, last week's parsha. So we talk about ayin tachas ayin, shein tachas shein. We talk about, even though the Chazal say that ayin never meant ayin tachas ayin, but let's just say the pasuk says ayin tachas ayin. If you were to go strictly with the letter of the law, someone reads the parsha, it says ayin tachas ayin. Shein tachas shein. I mean, it is what it is, right? So the Farshim, the Gemara comes and says it doesn't mean that. It never meant that. Okay, but now we are kind of a demarcation between what's exact, what the law tells us, like you said, the letter of the law, and again, the letter of the law is something that in our halachas we follow. We don't say that you violate the Shabbos because you're over the law of doing something on Shabbos. Well, when is Shabbos? Okay, Shabbos is Shiur, Shabbos is... Okay, so you have the 18 minutes. What happens if it's 19 and a half minutes or 20 minutes? Is it exact 18? No, it's 19. We can stretch it to 19 and a half too. It's nicht gefährlich. But I mean, so these are loose comparisons, but the difference between what is actual halacha, which in our system of justice, we do have exact. We're not, we don't say it's an approximate. It's exact. You're either over a lav, you're not over a lav. You do it this way, you do it this way. So so you're right. Letter and spirit is a good way of looking at it, but the fact of the matter is that you see even Rabbi Nossi, who was one of the great. I mean, Rabbi Nosson and the others were his Rebbe or whatever. But Rabbi Nossi was a decisor in halacha as well, and he differed with Rava. So you see that even amongst what we would like to think is definitive, there is still a machlokes. In any event, let's look at the next case. The next case is slightly different, and the Gemara says so. Okay, so we said Ahu Gavra. The next Ahu Gavra, a couple lines down from where that was. Ahu Gavra Dahavanaki Kifir Luzvune, right? So that case where a person was selling. So Rashi, I think it was Rashi who described kife is the zamim. There's like rings, earrings, nose rings. I mean, he was selling rings for sale. Koresh shitin v'shava chamishin. And he was selling them for 60 zuz, and they were worth 50 zuz, right? But in reality, he was prepared to negotiate and take 55, similar to the previous case, where he was willing to take less than the real shtus, right? So he was willing to take it. Osahu Gavra of Omar, so someone came, the same thing. If I give him 55 zuz, have a mechila, then there will be instant mechila because it's less than a shtus, which is the halacha. What happens if I overpay with 60 zuz, which is actually an exact shtus, this abe ledina, and then I'll bring him to din. So it's kind of the same case as before. So, but here's the twist. So whereas the previous Gemara says they came to Rava, and we know what Rava's halacha is. So, but he made a chilek between a lokeach min a tagar when you buy it from a storekeeper or when you buy it from a balabais. Also, l'kamid Rav Chizda. So they came before Rav Chizda. This is when you go, like I used to say, we go forum shopping. You go to the paisik that you think you're going to get the best result. So they came to Rav Chizda. So Rav Chizda said to them, Lo shana. He said the same thing. The halacha that I taught Rav Chizda different. I mean, he echoed Rav, but he taught the halacha is if you go to a tagor, when you go to a storekeeper, then there we hold the shtus as a shtus. But when you buy from a balabayas, so he's making now a definitive statement. When you buy from a balabayas, the whole idea of eino doesn't apply. What does that mean? That means that a balabayas, when he comes to sell, he doesn't think like a tagar. He doesn't think like a professional seller. He is purely purely. I mean, his thinking isn't a profit motive. It's what does this mean to me? What does this chayfetz mean to me? If it means to me this, that's what I'll sell it for. And if someone makes me a generous offer, but not the offer that I want, I'm going to say no, because I have an attachment. That's why he's not a professional seller. He has an attachment to a zak. Says Chazal. So the rabbis then come and say, if that's the case, then the whole principle of eino shouldn't apply to balabayas because he isn't thinking like a tagar. The whole thing that we want to make sure that in commerce and buying and selling, it's a fair process. But if everybody knows that if I go to a garage sale or an antique sale, or I go to someone's house and he's showing me something that is very beautiful, I can't equate that with going to the store. That's a whole different thing. But the important thing is, and the Gemara brings it down, is that everybody should know that. In other words, buyer beware that you're buying from a balabayas, not from a tagor, and therefore what you're paying is not what would necessarily fall in line with oinah. That's the key, is that oinah, throw it out the window. There is no oinah. There is no price fraud. When you're buying from a private hand, it's strictly the negotiated price between a buyer and a seller, what a seller wants from it and what a buyer is willing to pay. Therefore, if there is a discrepancy of a sixth or even more than a sixth, the whole principle where everybody agrees, right? In the halacha, everybody agrees that more than a sixth, the sale is voidable, is void, doesn't apply. Just does not apply to balabos, because a balabos has a whole different sort of a motivation to sell. And when you deal with him, you have to understand you're not dealing with a professional. Okay?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
2 points. I want to go back to what Menashe said, because I think it's a very important point, and that is there are people who are going to try to game the system. They're going to be conniving and try to game the system. And so if their motivation is to try to lower the price by virtue of a strategy, does the I'm not going to say Sanhedrin in this case, does the Beis Din say we take that into account knowing what's going on, or is it a strict letter of the law type of situation? Because if somebody's trying to maneuver that way, that's part of negotiating. And therefore, if it's that close and that, is it that strict that it's the letter of the law or not?
It is with regards to the professional seller. So this is very interesting because what you're asking is, if between a buyer and a seller, they negotiate a price which violates the shtus, why should we, the Beis Din or the outside public, interfere with two people who want to arrive at a price for an item?
Both who are sophisticated, the seller and the buyer.
So it seems, again, we have to place our mindset into the times of the Gemara, that clearly the Gemara, I mean the Amaroim or the Beis Din, whoever was in charge, did not have the faith in people to say that, especially in the small towns. I mean, maybe in the big city. Remember, Tagre Lud were the big city folks, and the big city folks, and therefore Reb Tarfon was their hero because he gave them a lot more leeway to be able to make business. But in the small towns, where the rabbis were really out to protect the buying public, they said, "Yeah, we're not going to take maybe negotiation completely away from you, but when you're playing with numbers that are skewed to one side or the other, we're not going to allow that to happen." So, absent our being there to actually understand the system from afar, we're going back a couple thousand years now. We're talking about 2nd century, 3rd century, whatever it was. We have to look back, and we can only view it from the lens of the rabbis are coming to protect the public from fraudulent behavior, and therefore, even within the sphere of two people wanting to negotiate a deal, there has to be fairness. And if one side is ignorant, right, we're protecting him because he's ignorant, because he doesn't know the price. So he thinks he got a great deal because he negotiated a price that turns out to still be more than a shtus different from what it should be. Then the Chazal say, no, that's not fair. So we're going to allow some leeway, but like you say, it's strict. It's very strict that once you get to a sixth, and Mistama, again, why a sixth? You can ask why a sixth. It must be because a sixth was relevant to the pricing of the time, that that Chazal said that, that people should keep their pricing, shouldn't gouge basically, and should keep their pricing within a certain range, and that's how it's fixed. I have to look maybe further if there's another basis or another makar for 1/6. But you see, and it's not fixed because you see that Rav Tarfon disagreed. Rav Tarfon disagreed with the Rabbanan. He said, I don't agree to a 6. To me, if you were a third and a 6 is a big margin. So Rav Tarfon felt that, but again, he was talking about the big city, right? Tagri Lud. Lud was a big city, and the folks there were maybe, like you say, more sophisticated and had a different perception on buying and selling. But in the small little towns and villages that made up a great majority of the Jews then in Bavel, the Chazal felt, the rabbis felt that they had to be more strict and had to preserve the order so that there wouldn't be sort of wild fluctuations between buying and selling, but they still carved out exceptions for private deals between people. Now, maybe there were a lot of private deals between people that weren't between, a meicher and a lokeach, in which case, if I went to you, Michael, privately and we negotiated, then the rules are different. There isn't there is not the
Well, on that point, Rabbi, so I think it's a valid point. Does only apply to a balabais, because balabais, let's say a balabais is growing food for themselves and they have leftover and they're selling that leftover and they end up selling it for a lower price than is in the marketplace, but their cost base is lower because they don't have workers and to pay for. So did in fact Ona apply to the balabais? Did that? I mean, are we going to go further on analyzing?
No, we got. It's exactly the point. You made exactly right. So we're not going to apply the principles of Ona for all those reasons, either because it's strictly to him, and he understands that he doesn't have to sell it at a certain price, so he can't then cry foul. I undersold. I mean, you're coming in with your eyes open, and you're going to make a profit almost no matter what, even if you sell it below the marketplace. So the question is, how frequently did people negotiate as a balabais versus a seller, right? In other words, by the way, you can say this is the black market. This is the non-official market where people don't want to pay full price, but they know that Yankel has a farm, has a backyard where he's selling all kinds of produce. So he goes to him and they negotiate a separate price. They didn't, in other words, it wasn't equivalent to today. We're not going to say there was antitrust if there was price fixing, if a balabais who was under the radar didn't want to participate with the marketplace and sell what the marketplace was selling. So he can sell it at a number that he can justify for himself, and it was known, buyer beware, that if you're dealing with a balabais, you're not dealing with protected with a protected situation where the chazal, the rabbis will protect you because there's no ono. It's out the window. So if you're dealing with a buyer, you can either overpay or underpay at your own risk, and you will not get the protection of the Rabbanon or the Bezdin, who will say, "Oh, you overpaid," or a seller coming back and say, "I undersold." No, when you're a balabas, there's no undersold. You're negotiating in good faith based on what you think your cucumber should be. Like you say, I grow cucumbers for myself. I have extra cucumbers. I don't have to sell them at 5 zuz a bushel. I can sell them at 3 zuz a bushel and make a profit. So again, it's very good.
I have a thought here.
Yeah.
Okay, so we keep coming back to the question of that this idea that 1/6 that's somehow the magic number, where that was based on the business of the time. I have a theory here. I don't know if anybody, I've looked it up other than the pasuk which I shared here, which is that we have certain types of averos. I believe this is with something where you something was supposed to be for the Mishkan of the base of Mikdash, and you misused it or whatever, that then you have to add 1/5. And here's a theory: we have a lot of things, a third, a quarter, a fifth, a sixth, and so on, where they just did a simple fraction, and so we have a literally midoraisa fraction of 1/5 being a repayment for in a case of certain types of sins, a penalty payment. And so if you go back one step from that, the next step would be 1/6, a little bit, which is a little bit less. Doesn't matter what it is. A 6 is less than a fifth. To say, okay, here's a number that we're going to say up to 1/6 is a business issue or whatever. And because when you get to a fifth, we're talking about the amount that's a penalty. And so maybe that's where, maybe it's a thought, maybe that's where somehow the idea of 1/6 as the particular number rather than a quarter or a fifth or a third, etc.
Right, but you see by theft, Menashe Arba v'Chamisha, right? If someone is caught, he has to pay kefil, he has to pay double. But if
right, but this is specific, right? That which is of course much more. That's 100%.
Right. Then you have
this, but this is a specific
right? So
case where we have 1/5 extra.
So you see different fractions being used, but we've not seen a shtus anywhere being you're right. We have a chomesh or an arba or this or that, but the shtus number was never, except for this instance of price fraud. There's no parallel, right? There's no
right.
other...
So not that I know of. So that's what I'm saying is that maybe this might be an indirect source of where the Rabbanan brought this. Maybe this will be interesting to find out if there's anyone.
Yeah, I will look a little bit further. Yeah, I'm going to look a little bit further.
Where that might come from.
That much thought, but I will look further and see if there's any makor further for shtus as to why it happens to be a sixth at the time. Maybe again, it could have been that at the time of the Gemara, like you say. I mean, they have to understand the marketplace itself, and that's what the marketplace sort of spoke to them and said that we'll tolerate up to a certain
right.
number.
But I'm saying more chicken and the egg. In other words, is it that the marketplace based itself on a sixth because a sixth had a historical thing that if you go more than that to the next level of fifth, that's already a penalty, clearly wrong?
Right.
Or
I see.
is it that they came up with a sixth independent of that because that's the way that business was, and a lot of things are based on the normal business practice?
Right. Good question. So we'll look further and see if we can find a real makor.
Rabbi,
Jay.
did they ever have a discussion of graduated? So above $1,000, it's a sixth, or above 10,000, it's less than a sixth?
No. It wasn't graduated the way you would think that, the more the fraud, the greater the penalty. It wasn't that way. It seems that once you hit the magic number, anything beyond that was all the same. So
no matter the price.
Yeah. And if not, I mean, it could be that in some spheres, I don't know of any sphere where in our halacha where it's dependent on how.
I mean,
how much
that's entered
more
into
the fraud
secular
is.
law.
I don't know.
Right,
I don't know.
secular laws like that. There are different rules and
there are different sometimes different categories.
Things, what can be small claims, what has to be a regular court, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So again, so to complete this thought, says the Gemara, Amalei Rav Dimi. Rav Dimi says Yasher. It's like Yeshikayach. You said right. Yasher, and Rabbi Loza also said Yasher. That in other words, they endorsed this fact that it made sense to distinguish between a professional seller and a balabas who was not a professional seller. Now, so lest you think we're out of the woods, now says the Gemara, correct the Gemara of Ha'anan Tanan. This is very good because you gave us a good distinction. But we learned in a Mishnah, and that's the Mishnah we're about to learn, by the way. We learned in a Mishnah, what does that Mishnah say? We'll peek ahead. Kishem she'ano lehedjait. There is a lashon, which is a little bit ambiguous. Kishem she'ano lehedjait, kein hano l'tagya. Just as there is oino for a hedjat, meaning a regular person, a non-professional, we should, okay, I take it back. A hedjat, the Gemara is going to explain to us what a hedjat is. but it seems to be a hedget is a non-professional. So the Gemara says, just as there is a law for a hedget, a regular person, so too is there a law for a tiger for a professional, for a seller. Frek the Gemara now man hedget. Who is a hedget? Who is that regular person? Says the Gemara, la balabayas? Is it not a balabayas? Right? And which is what we just got through saying. Now, what do we say the halacha is for a non-professional that just no one know? This Mishnah Beferish just tells us kishem she'ino lahedjay. There is a no for a hedjay. So this counters the entire principle that a balabas is under the radar. According to this Mishnah, which we now quote, we just learned the halacha, and everybody, all the Amaroim, everybody agreed that no, there is no oinoah for balabas because it's a private sale. Fakert, the Mishnah says specifically there is oinoah for a hedjit. So again, we're not defining a hedjit yet, but we're assuming a hedjit means a regular person, a non-professional. So if that's the case, what's pshat in our Gemara? Omar Rav Chizda. So Rav Chizda, again, trying to understand what's going on here. So he says b'tzadra yosef that we're speaking, and Rashi says big day canvas. It's the Russian big day canvas. Ha'onde limko. In other words, if you're selling canvas, now canvas was it's not the normal material that one sells when someone sells clothing or anything else, that you want to sell in the marketplace. Remember, we had an example of someone sold silk, right? Silk in the marketplace is something that you take and you make a baguette, you make clothing out of it, whether it's a dress or a suit or whatever it happens to be. So he wants to say that if you're doing bitzad, so now Rav Chizda says that our Mishnah is speaking b'tzadri yosa, and b'tzadri yosa you have oino abel tone tashmisasa abel mane tashmitei. But as far as normal begodim, in other words, material for begodim, the kara alei. We're now talking about a hedget, not a tagre, not his profession. So he wants to make a chilik. But when it says hedget, it's talking about a hedget selling canvas. But if a hedget, in other words, if a balabos sells other items, garments or material or whatever, the yakre alei, because it's more dear to him. In other words, it's choshev to him. Lo mezaben lahu, he does not sell it ila b'dmei yisera unless he's selling it for more money. So what is the Gemara telling us? The Gemara is making a chilik here. We just got through saying that for a balabas there is no inyan of shtus because he has a different mindset. Says Rav Chizda, I want to break that down and say specifically. When does a balabos have a mindset that's different than a tagre, and therefore you can't hold him to a no? That's when he's selling, normal material garments, and they have a special chavivus, a special, even if he's selling, garments that he had bought for his wife, and they're expensive, and he wants to resell them. He don't want to sell them for whatever it was selling in the marketplace. He wants to sell them for more. Says the Gemara that he may do, but when you're selling things like, and Rashi says, if it's maybe this is a more common material, big day canvas, if it's big day canvas that are in the marketplace to be sold, he says that has a different sort of look to it, and that is covered by shtus. So basically, what is Rav Chizda telling us? He wants to make a chilik because, and again, maybe the Gemara to this Mishnah we're about to learn will give us more definition. But basically, you have to distinguish between one type of garment and another. So if you're dealing with what he calls canvas, which may be a more routine item in the marketplace, let's call it that for now. But what is canvas? I mean, maybe a lot of begadim are made of rough material, and therefore they're subject to what everybody else is selling. Okay, but when you have a fine, look, you can go to a dressmaker or to even a suit maker and buy suits for thousands of dollars as opposed to off the rack for 250 or 100, whatever they're selling it for. What are you going to say that it's one price fits all and therefore it's shtus if it's sold for this number? No, you have to understand that the marketplace has its own rationale and comes up with a number. That number has to be one that people are willing to pay. Otherwise, everything will sit on the rack. No one will buy it.
So, Rabbi, is this a distinction between an artisan and a regular Baal Abayis? So
Right.
that if you're an artisan, then you're a specialist and you're dealing with special material on the same framework as a.
That's what we're calling a balabais, right? That's what we're calling a balabais. Exactly right. Okay, so all right, so that's the end of this Gemara. Let's take a quick look here. So balabais. So okay, the first we did the other Rashi. The first Rashi in the narrow line. Balabais machshitin b'kli tashmish shalo. Tachshitin, in other words, his the jewelry or other items that he has chavivin alav. They're more dear to him. In a marchen elabiyoker. It's either sell it for more money or don't sell it at all. There is no unknown when you're dealing in the private hand. So he brings down also that that this was the common understanding among many of the Paiskim. He brings down B'Shelos Rav Achai, and he's saying that also is the pshat. Kifi is nizamin. We said those are like earrings, nizamin, or nose rings, nizamin. Then have a mechila la alter to have a pachas mishnus, right? His boys bedina b'chtei sheyira la tagir. Or he brings over there that you have to respect, that you have to understand what the tagir is selling. So basically, what we're left with is a halacha. Rava's halacha, which is very clear. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi disputes the halacha with regard only to the shtus, and he's giving a defrauded party an option to buy or to sell, which is not the halacha. And the door is open, and that's what this next Gemara is going to really focus on. The door is open as to when he says it is an option. What does he mean by the option? Is it an option for the buyer, the seller? How do we understand that option? This Gemara is now going to talk about that in a little bit more detail about the option. Okay, so let's start the Mishnah. So the Mishnah Nun Aleph on an Aleph says Echad halokeach and Echad hamocher, both a buyer and a seller. Yesh lahem oino, have a price, a fraud, and vayter kishem shono lahedjay, just like there is oino for a hedjay for a l'chova balabos, kach oino l'tager, which we just explained in this Gemara we learned. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and this is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, ein ono l'tager. That there is no oino for a tagir. When he means by it, so again, the Gemara and Rashi says the common mefarish law. We're going to explain what that means, because remember we're saying that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi holds there is the discussion of whether or not there is oino for a seller, right? Remember we said that there is. The whole oino is for a buyer. Why? Because the buyer has the chayfetz and he has the option to show it to someone. So we say, show it to someone or you lose. I mean, forever hold you can't argue. But we said for a mocher, the potential is that once he sells it, he has no mode of comparison as to whether or not he made a bad deal. Therefore, we're going to allow an open-ended period for a mocher, because he doesn't know whether he made a bad deal or not. So comes Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, and this Mishnah says, Ein Oino L'Tagir, and the Gemara says, Gemara Mefarish, but in the back of our minds, are we not thinking he means for a mocher, there is no ono, because the mocher can always retract, because he has no way of knowing if he made a bad deal. I'm suggesting, and I'm not saying that that's what the Mishnah is saying, but when the Gemara says, L'kamon, we're going to learn later, L'chayra, that's the thinking. But we'll see. Again, I'm just putting it out there, but we have to see it once the Gemara gives us more explanation. And the Gemara, the Mishnah concludes, Mishahut lalav yodo alohel yoino. Pay attention to these words. Mishahut alav, to person who is defrauded, yodo alohel yona, he is the one to make the choice. Remember, Yehuda Nasi is arguing on Rava, and he's saying that the defrauded party right, has the choice. What choice? The choice to retract the entire deal, say it's void, or to keep the deal and get his money back. So this is that Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, and says the Mishnah, Rotza Amalotain li ma'osi, he can say, give me my money, Otain li ma she'inosi, or just give me what I was defrauded. In other words, this is Rabbi Yehuda Anasi saying that for an exact shtus, the defrauded party can have a choice. Now, let's carefully look at the words of the Mishnah, because I'm going to give away what is now going to be a major discussion. What is the words of the Mishnah? Mishahut alav yada yona. Someone who is defrauded, he has the upper hand. Who was defrauded? Says the Mishnah, Rotza omali tenli ma'osi, give me my money. Who says give me my money in a deal? The buyer or the seller? Only the buyer. The seller never says give me my money, because the seller doesn't have money in the deal. He has a chayfetz in the deal. So it seems like from the words of the Mishnah, when Rabbi Yehuda Anasi says Yada al Yona, and he gives an example, who is the example? Rotza Omar Tainli Ma'asi, give me my money, or Tainli my She'enasi, or give me, in other words, give me my money, my whole money for the chayfetz, or just give me the shtus. So that has to be talking about a buyer, because the buyer is the one who's invested with the money, not the seller. So that's just a little bit of a tidbit which the Gemara is going to pounce on, we're going to see, but I'm just pointing it out. So when we learn it, you'll see that the Mishnah itself in Rabbi Yehuda Anasi seems to be saying, even that he says Yada al Yona, and we interpret it to mean buyer or seller, the Mishnah itself is talking about the buyer, not the seller, because it says, give me my money, and it's the buyer who says, give me my money, right? So we all understand that now, that this is a little bit of a giveaway, is that Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, in his example, where he says Yad al Yona, he's referring to a buyer, not a seller. Okay, says Rashi, Rabbi Yehuda Mefarish lo, Mishahut lalav, this owner, the person who was defrauded, Tein li ma'asi imnis ena lokeya. Give me my money if the lokeya wants to just void the deal, he can void the deal. But if he just wants to have his money back from the fraud, says Rashi, and in Ensa Lokeach, all he wants is the fraud money, he wants to keep the deal, then you have to give him the fraud money, meaning the sixth, and the rest of it he gets to keep. So this is our Mishnah. This is the definitive Mishnah that we've been talking about in the last number of weeks when we talk about Rabbi Yehuda Anasi's position and this whole thing about Oino. This is the source of it, right? And this Mishnah argues on the halacha, which we kept saying, but we also see that there's a chilik between Hedyot and Tager, and all of this. So all of this now has to come out into the open what we mean. So now let's just start to get a little bit of a start, but it becomes a whole sugya that we're going to get into. So the Gemara first says, where does this all come from? Menahana Mili. Where do we know this whole halacha of Oino? So the Gemara says that we know it from our pasuk, because it says in our pasuk, that if you're involved in commerce and you sell something to your fellow Jew, then al tonu, then you should not commit fraud. This is the source, and I think Menashe, you showed us that when you log down there. That's the pasuk al tonu, that you should not commit fraud. So now this is what. So now the Gemara is going to say as follows: Ainly I understand that when the fraud is committed against the lokeach, against the buyer, that you have to pay, because that's what it says. Who's the amisecho? Amisecho is the lokeach. Al tonu, you can't defraud the lokeach. Says Beferish. This ana moicher minayin. How do you know the whole Indian of nisanu moicher, that a buyer, that a seller can himself be defrauded, right? So it says Beferish. Says the Gemara, Talmud Lomar Okona. It says in the pasuk Okona. You have that pasuk in front of you, Menashe, where it says that, or if you buy it, Okona, Al Tono, you shouldn't defraud. So now we see that it reverses well. That even from the sellers, from this word, we see that the seller can be defrauded as well as the buyer. Okay, that's the source. So the Gemara has now pinpointed the source. Now the Gemara's kasha is going to be, as it is many times, why do we need both? Why can't we learn one from the other without the Torah telling us specifically that it refers to a seller and a buyer? Says the Gemara, the itzrach lemichtav lokeach, the itzrach lemitzrach moicha, that it has to say specifically in the Torah, which we know is focused on brevity. So if it doesn't have to say an extra word, it doesn't. Here it has to articulate separately the buyer and separately the seller. Why? Why do we need both? Says the Gemara, because if the Torah only told us about fraud against the seller, then you can't defraud the seller. So we say that, in other words, if the Torah specifically is referring to the mocher, because we say he knows what he's selling. In other words, counter to what we said before, where the seller may be in an isolated place and may actually not know what he's doing, right? We're saying that the seller is a baki, that the seller does his homework, and when he goes into the marketplace, he's selling it at a number. It's not random. It's because that number is a number he's researched. Then why should we give him the benefit of the doubt if that he should be able to claim fraud? He was the one who did all the homework. He was the one who put the item for sale at a price. He should live with that price. Why do we give him the benefit of the doubt, right? But the buyer who is not familiar with the purchase, therefore, then we say, right? So we say that the Torah did not refer to loisanu, that you shouldn't defraud him. Right? That's why he writes it for the buyer. So the buyer has to be protected, right? The ikos of Rahman Lakeach. And if the Torah said only the Rakeach Mushim de Kokoni, because he's buying, because people say, it's the Lashon, because people say, De Omer Inche Zavna Koniso, because people say that Zavna Koniso, what does Zavna Koniso mean? That when you buy, you are kaineh. Meaning, when you buy, you've made a good deal, because the principle here is, and this is very interesting, is that Chazal say that money is not a good thing to have. Why? Because when you have money, then you might tend to be frivolous with your money. But if you take your money and you buy something, again, it didn't always mean real estate. It meant a chayfetz. Now that chayfetz has a certain value. More times than not, at least what the Gemara is thinking, is that chayfetz will go up in value. So if you have money, just money, then again, you may be foolish. You may spend it on something that doesn't make sense or whatever. But once you spend money on something that is a mamish, that is a mamoshes, it's a chayfetz, then you've acquired something which has the ability to appreciate. So we say there, he is in good shape. But the seller is getting money. And what do we say? And the word on the street is that if you've sold an item, you've lost. Why? Because now you've acquired money, and the money, as we said before, you could spend frivolously. So the whole idea is it's better to have a chayfetz than money. So what the Gemara is learning pshat here is that the lokeach is in better shape because he spent his money on an item, and that item will appreciate in value. So he should not have the ability to come back and say, I was defrauded. The seller, on the other hand, if we're making an argument for why the seller can scream fraud, is because he took a chayfetz, which was a specific item, and he sold it for money. Now he has money, and the word on the street is that when you have money, then oivid, you've lost because you've taken a chayfetz, something solid and good, and given it up for money. Now that money can be frivolous, so that now we need to protect the seller, because the seller now has money and he may make mistake with his money, right? Therefore, says the Gemara, the Torah needs to give us an admonition for both a buyer and a seller, because each one can be a plus or a minus. If you would have just lokeach, you would learn out only one side of the equation, that the lokeach needs to be protected. Why? Because he wasn't aware. It's the seller who's the bucky. But if you look at it from the other perspective, where the buyer is buying something that, according to the Gemara, is a solid investment, whatever that item is, it's solid. It's something that it's considered that he is gained, even if it's an item that is fungible. Okay, let's say he's buying produce or food or something. So at least the Gemara is saying that that's an item that can be a positive to him, because he can take that chayfetz and use it or consume it or whatever it is. But money, and this gives you an idea of how the Chazal look at money, is that money as a medium for exchange, it's great, but in and of itself, it is not the end to the means. And the end to the end to the means is the chayfetz, is the acquisition, whether it's a karkar, metaltalin, that's the end. The money is sort of the medium, and the Gemara is telling us, interestingly, that the medium is never a strong commodity. And he says it, because in the street they say the word is when a person sells, he loses. So what does that mean when a person sells, he loses? Why is there such a statement? The teretz is because money is here one day, gone the next. Chayfetz, whether it's a consumable or not, is a solid thing. So we have to understand that mindset. So based on that mindset, says the Gemara, now we understand why the Torah has to give us both sides of the equation, because you wouldn't know a seller has rights of a no from a buyer, and you wouldn't know a buyer has rights of a no to a seller. Says Rashi, right? The Kimle Bezavinte. He does it, he knows what he's doing, right? He prepares and he knows exactly what he's doing. In other words, there is mamoshes, there's something solid here. You're losing because it's easy enough for that money to sort of be frittered away. So this gives you an understanding of how Chazal looked at money and chayfetz, which is why the Gemara always says, and we know this from our own experience, is that when you buy a commodity, whether it's real estate or sure, it can go down, it can go up, but the impression is that when you buy a chayfetz, that chayfetz has an inherent value, which you'll never lose. That's the impression that the Gemara wants to give us, whereas money is fungible and here today, gone tomorrow. So what do you have left? If you have a chayfetz, you have something solid. If not, not. So that's the answer to the question of why we need both. Okay, so I think we'll stop here. So this gives us at least an introduction to the Mishnah and tells us exactly why a buyer and a seller each have a no from the pasuk, and the Gemara explained to us why it has to say both. Now we're going to get into the heart of the Mishnah, which I've alluded to, and we're going to try to understand more deeply. The Gemara is going to want to ask, who is the Mishnah? Who is the author of the Mishnah? Is it in fact Rabbi Yehuda Anasi or not? Because we think Rabbi Yehuda Anasi is the one who tells us this Mishnah, but it's not so clear that that's who the Mishnah is really talking about. So Shem will pick that up from here, and I'm going to take a closer look, Blineder, on the whole issue of shtus and see if there's an actual core to shtus, which Menashe alluded to and saying from the pasuk where we're talking about 1/5 for in the case of kedusha or korbanos. It says a fifth, so maybe that fifth somehow has some bearing on why we say a 60 or not. So we'll take a look, and maybe we'll have something definitive next week.